At 11:16 p.m., Mr. Zahidi entered the kitchen and took a cup from a shelf against a wall in the central part of the kitchen. He placed the cup on the bench next to kettle and walked to the opposite side of the kitchen, returning with a bag of CSR raw sugar, which he poured into the cup. At 11:17 p.m., Mr. Zahidi walks past the victim towards the fridges in the kitchen and removes the carton of milk. He pours some milk into the cup and returns the carton to the fridge. Neither Mr. Belmont nor the victim were physically obstructing access to the fridges, the island, or the bench, except to the extent that Mr. Zahidi had to walk around the portion of the island bench that they were standing in front of. At 11:18 p.m., after dipping a tea bag into cup, Mr. Zahidi stands motionless for about 15 seconds. When he tops off his drinks with water from the kettle, Mr. Zahidi then moves towards the island bench to the left of where the victim is standing. No interaction occurs. At 11:18 p.m., Mr. Zahidi bends over the island bench to obtain what appears to be a spoon from a lower shelf of the island bench. The victim presents no impediment to this action, and again, no interaction between Mr. Zahidi and the victim occurs. A third man wearing thongs, glasses with a ponytail, who had been cleaning the kitchen, is standing near to where Mr. Zahidi was. There is also no interaction with this man. The victim and Mr. Belmont continue their conversation totally unrelated to Mr. Zahidi. In the following 3 to 5 seconds, Mr. Zahidi straightens up with the spoon, transfers it to his left hand, and takes a step forward towards the side bench. He then reaches for a knife contained in a knife block on the side bench and aggressively tries to remove the knife he selected. Mr. Zahidi is initially unable to properly remove the knife and throws his hands up and down violently in an attempt to take the knife from the block. In doing so, a knife is eventually removed approximately 1 second later with sufficient force to cause the knife block to be thrown up in the air, landing on the ground in between the two benches. The noise made by the removal of the knife attracts the attention of the victim, who turns slightly to look into the direction of Mr. Zahidi. As the victim turns to look down towards him, Mr. Zahidi takes a short step towards the victim while holding the knife in his right hand and thrusts the knife forward, and it appears into the midriff of the victim. The victim retreats from Mr. Zahidi backwards around the island bench. Mr. Zahidi follows the victim, clearly seeking to stab him further. As the victim starts to move away, Mr. Zahidi reaches out to grab the victim's clothing with his left hand, whilst continuing to hold the knife in his right. Mr. Zahidi stabs the victim again as the victim starts to fall at the ground. At this point, Mr. Zahidi has stabbed or tried to stab the victim in the midriff area 3 times. The victim falls against the island bench, causing it to move and causing the victim to lose his balance and fall to the floor of the kitchen. The third man retreats as Mr. Belmont has moved cautiously around to the other side of the kitchen. As the victim fell, Mr. Zahidi also stumbled to the floor and dropped the knife. The victim repeatedly is saying, "What have I done?" Mr. Zahidi says nothing throughout the entire attack. Mr. Zahidi quickly regains the knife while maintaining a grip on the victim. The victim attempts to stand and rotate away from Mr. Zahidi. Mr. Zahidi continues to attack the victim with the knife, thrusting it into the upper back of the victim. At this time, Mr. Zahidi has a hold of the victim's wrist and preventing him from moving out of reach. Mr. Zahidi raises his hands up over his head and thrusts the knife down towards the head of the victim in a stabbing motion. The victim loses his balance and again falls to the floor while Mr. Zahidi stands up and continues to attack the victim with the knife. The victim on his back raises his hands in a defensive manner and attempts to use his legs to repel Mr. Zahidi. The victim tries to roll away as Mr. Belmont attempts to distract Mr. Zahidi and stop the attack. The victim eventually manages to get on to his feet and flees the kitchen. The whole attack, from grabbing the knife until the victim manages to flee the kitchen, takes about 30 seconds. At 11:19 p.m., Mr. Zahidi abruptly stops seeking to attack the victim and walks back to the sink, tossing the knife under a running tap. While other people at the hostel tended to the wound of the victim, Mr. Zahidi walked aimlessly around the kitchen/office area, not speaking to anyone for about 30 seconds. At 11:19, Mr. Zahidi kicked the victim's phone on the floor and then washed his hands in the sink where he had earlier thrown the knife. Mr. Zahidi washed the knife and then tried to put it back into the kitchen block. Unable to put the knife back, he put the knife back in the sink and walked out of the hostel. The police were called at 11:06 p.m., real time and not CCTV time, as there was a difference in between these two. And upon arrival, found Mr. Zahidi in an area adjacent to the hostel. He was taken to Perth police station and charged. The victim was taken to Royal Perth Hospital in a critical condition and underwent emergency surgery. The victim had sustained multiple penetrating stab wounds and lacerations to his torso, chest, buttocks, forearm, upper back, and back of the head. He lost a significant amount of blood and his left lung had collapsed, requiring a blood transfusion. The injuries were life-threatening. Without medical treatment, the victim would likely have died from loss of blood. The injuries resulted in permanent scarring to multiple areas of victim's body. The victim experienced a complication from these scars in the form of keloid development, thick raising scarring. The victim's gait and mobility were significantly impaired on the left-hand side, requiring long-term physiotherapy and a foot brace. The victim's psychological injuries were recorded to be acute stress response, hypervigilance, agitation, and restlessness. Mr. Zahidi appeared for a one-day trial before Her Honour Justice Whitby in the Supreme Court of Western Australia on 15 January 2024. On 17 January 2024, Her Honour found Mr. Zahidi not guilty by reason of unsoundness of mind in the attempted murder on Supreme Court Indictment 22 of 2022. He was made subject to a custody order pursuant to Section 21 of the Criminal Law Mentally Impaired Accused Act 1996, Western Australia, in conjunction with Schedule 1 of the Act. The limiting term is taken to have commenced on the 17 January 2024, being the date on which the existing custody order was made. It is accepted by the state that Mr. Zahidi had spent the period of 8 September 2021 to 16 January 2024 in custody prior to the making of existing custody order. The period of 861 days includes a period of involuntary treatment at the Franklin Centre. Therefore, the limiting term may commence on 8 September 2021. I, as in Your Honour, now turn to assess the relevant sentencing factor and determine the limiting term. The maximum penalty for the count of attempted murder is life imprisonment. Mr. Zahidi's personal circumstances. In her reasons for decision, Whitby J. referred to the personal circumstances of the respondent as contained in the agreed facts prepared for trial. Whitby J. determined that Mr. Zahidi suffers from a mental impairment named schizophrenia, PTSD, and major depressive order. Relevantly, Mr. Zahidi is 30 years of age, having been born on 31st December 1993. At the time of the offence, he was 27 years of age. Mr. Zahidi was born in Afghanistan and travelled to Australia from Indonesia by boat when he was 15 or 16 years of age. He was initially detained on Christmas Island before being transferred to Port Augusta and later Melbourne. On 15 December 2010, he was granted a permanent residency visa. Mr. Zahidi moved to Perth after obtaining a permanent residency. He has no family in Australia. Mr. Zahidi purchased a truck and worked as a delivery driver for a number of years. The state referred to Mr. Zahidi's childhood trauma, which was also outlined by Whitby J. Dr. Brett, consultant psychiatrist, stated in his report before Whitby J. that his previous psychiatric history revealed that he suffered trauma at a young age after witnessing people being killed by the Taliban. This made him fearful for his life and his family's well-being. Further, when Mr. Zahidi travelled by boat to Australia, he thought he would die. Dr. Brett stated Mr. Zahidi has flashbacks of those experiences and has described increasing anxiety. I, as in Your Honour, take these personal circumstances and historical challenges into account in determining the limiting term. Mr. Zahidi has a criminal record for other offending prior to the offence which is the subject of this application. His previous convictions include committing the offence of trespass and stealing, for which a conditional suspended imprisonment order was imposed in the District Court on the 28th of June 2019. Mr. Zahidi breached that order 3 times, resulting in his incarceration in June 2020. In addition, Mr. Zahidi has an early conviction for assault occasioning bodily harm on 26 March 2018 in respect of an offence committed on 9th June 2017. The fact that Mr. Zahidi has a criminal record is not an aggravating factor, but the limiting factor is not to be determined on the basis that he is a person of good character. Seriousness of the offending. I, as in Your Honour, now turn to the seriousness of the offending. There are a number of aggravating features in respect to Mr. Zahidi's offending. First, the offence was entirely unprovoked. Secondly, Mr. Zahidi armed himself with a lethal weapon, namely a knife. The victim was unable to defend himself and particularly vulnerable to the unprovoked attack. Third, the attack was persistent, with Mr. Zahidi pursuing the victim around the kitchen bench to continue the attack. When Mr. Zahidi dropped the knife, he retrieved it and recommenced stabbing the victim. The victim was asking why Mr. Zahidi was doing this to him. Fourth, the infliction of the stab wounds was to vulnerable parts of the victim's body, including the middle of the chest, the interscapular region, his interior chest wall, and his head. The extent of the injuries to the victim were life-threatening. If the victim had not received medical treatment, he would have died from blood loss. The injuries, including 12 stab wounds, including a 14 centimeter laceration to his back and a 6 centimeter laceration to his chest, a hemothorax in the chest causing total collapse of the left lung, a rib fracture, and significant blood loss. The victim suffered immediate psychological symptoms including hypervigilance, agitation, and restlessness consistent with an acute stress response. The victim was in Royal Perth Hospital for 17 days and had at least 4 months of outpatient treatment. The victim has gait and mobility impairments requiring a foot brace and lifelong physiotherapy. Mitigating factors. The principal mitigating factor for Mr. Zahidi is that he is deemed to have pleaded guilty at the first reasonable opportunity. Accordingly, I, as in Your Honor, grant a 25% discount under Section 9AA of the Sentencing Act. I, as in Your Honor, find that Mr. Zahidi is remorseful for his act. Mr. Zahidi counsel read a letter of apology during the hearing. In that letter, Mr. Zahidi expressed his remorse and contrition for his acts. As I, as in Your Honor, have previously stated, I, again, Your Honor, will take into account your personal circumstances, your, as in the accused, personal circumstances, and particular, the accused challenging historical background. Best assessment of the sentence that would have been imposed. The sentence imposed for attempted murder are variable and there's no tariff for usual sentencing range. Counsel for the state referred to a number of authorities by the way of comparison. After considering all relevant sentencing factors, including the discounts for plea guilty and contemporary reason for sentencing, I, as in Your Honor, have determined that the sentence that would have been imposed for the count of the indictment is 10 years immediate imprisonment. I, as in Your Honor, therefore set a limiting term of 10 years for Mr. Zahidi's existing custody order pursuant to Section 264 of the CLMI Act. In accordance with Section 264, subsection 3 of the CMLI Act, the limiting term is taken to have commenced on the day on which existing custody order was made, unless the court orders that the term be taken to have commenced on an earlier date. Given that Mr. Zahidi spent 861 days in custody in respect to offence prior to making the existing custody order on 17 January 2024, I, as in Your Honor, order that the limiting term is taken to have commenced on 8 September 2021. For these reasons, I, as in Your Honor, order that the limiting term for the custody order in respect of Mr. Zahidi made on 17 January 2024 pursuant to Section 21 of the repealed Act and further continued as a custody order under the CLMI Act to be set as 10 years. As the limiting term has not yet expired, Mr. Zahidi remains a supervised person pursuant to CLMI Act. His custody order will continue to be administered by the Mental Impairment Review Tribunal.